Welcome everyone. My name is Hilary Horrocks and I'm from Edinburgh TUC. I'm the delegate from the local branch of the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists. The Trade Union Council, together with the Living Rent Tenants Union, has been marking the anniversary of Grenfell every year here in Edinburgh. In 2018 and 19, we held silent vigils in the centre of the town. And this year we're able to do this again. So whoever can come, please do. The foot of the mound in the city centre at 4:30 p.m. next Tuesday, the actual anniversary of the fire. And we'll be having a silent vigil holding placards carrying photos of the 72 people who lost their lives. During the pandemic, we paid homage to Grenfell online in various ways. And we're pleased to continue this today, since it means we can hear representatives from Grenfell community and others and make the meeting accessible to people wherever they are. I think Grenfell was a disaster that showed in stark relief the state of the country that Britain has become. The public inquiry is still uncovering the criminal negligence of national and local government and of the contractors towards the safety of working class people. It's the same hypocrisy and contempt, really, that the government displayed in its handling of the pandemic. I'm sure our speakers tonight will talk about this in more detail. Now, they'll each speak for around 10 minutes. Can we ask you to put any questions in the chat? We'll take these once we've heard all the speakers. And if there's time, we can take brief contributions from the audience. We'll finish by 8 p.m. Right. So first we welcome Joe Delaney, who's a campaigner for justice for Grenfell and the Grenfell Action Group. Joe was one of those evacuated from the Lancaster West estate in North Kensington after the fire, so has very personal knowledge of what happened. So Joe, I think you're going to give us a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, I will do, but I'll put it up in a second.
Yes.
I was going to say, at the moment, just to my left here is out this window is Grenfell Tower. It's less than 10 meters away behind me, and it still just blights the landscape around here. You do notice with quite a lot of people that when they look, they tend to their eyes just tend to skip over it. And most people don't even notice that they're doing it. It was only when someone pointed it out to me that I started noticing it in other people. So, I mean, the biggest thing that we've got 5 years on is that there's still this huge scar in this community that hasn't been dealt with, and for all the government's talk about how, the Grenfell is at the heart of what their response was about, and that the council say the same. It is utterly not true, and it never has been true with this council or this government. Now, you should be able to see a PowerPoint presentation. This document that I'm showing you here, like, you don't worry if you can't read it. This was the briefing that the Grenfell Tower Recovery Task Force gave the PM on Saturday, the 17th of June at 11 a.m. And what I found most interesting about this was there you go. What I found most interesting about this was on page 6, this page here, number 34 there at the bottom, which I'll zoom in on. Following the Grenfell Tower fire, concerns were raised about the potential for civil unrest. That's all they were worried about from the outset. They were more worried about the fact, were we going to smash up their property, than they were about saving any people's lives, it would seem. Because look at how much effort's being put into this. And this wasn't uncommon with them, unfortunately. I mean, this document here, apparently what the government do is whenever there's some kind of, incident that's in the papers or in the media, they prepare these little press reports where they find all of the references to it in the press and put them together. I can only imagine they must have like several warehouses full by now with Boris Johnson's stuff. But I mean, to give you an idea, look, at a time when they were saying there was unprecedented workload for all of those involved, they had time to put together what is on average 30 to 40 page document every day that was just saying all the things that was in the media about them, you know. And this wasn't just a thing that they were doing in the immediate aftermath. This email that I'm showing you now was from the 27th of June. Sasha Jevons was one of the executive team at the TMO, which was Kensington and Chelsea's arm's length management organisation. And the important parts, I thought, were the final two paragraphs. In addition to this, we have a problem programming key fobs, you know, and if the decision is to withdraw the police cordon, the only option is private security. If this is what is required, however, this will not be able to respond to any potential theft activity or civil unrest. See, this was weeks after the fire. Now, they're still saying, despite the fact that we haven't shown any inclination whatsoever to do anything like that, we are still being treated as the problem rather than being victims of a problem, you know. And that's what I mean. I talk about this stuff deliberately. Where we are 5 years on, I'm afraid to say that I don't think this mindset has changed in the slightest with central or local government whatsoever in the past 5 years. The only sincere efforts I've seen from any of the institutions involved to change so far has been the fire service. You know, the fire brigade have now implemented 26 of the 29 recommendations that were made for them. The government in February 2020 voted against implementing any of phase one's recommendations, you know, and that's before phase two's ones come out, you know. But, you know, our council's always been a bit of a law unto itself, as you can see. You know, they ripped out cycle lanes that they were legally obliged to keep. And, you know, once again, seemingly get away with this with impunity. You know, look, the other councils get put into special measures for it. They just drop a call to Grant Shapps, you know, and boom, Kensington, Chelsea, the Royal Borough, oh, everything's fine for them. And you see, and this is the London cycle route as a result. You see this, it stops dead around Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea. You know, this is the lawlessness that we see from these Tory-run councils down here. They absolutely do whatever they want with impunity. And actually, I told a slight lie. This isn't the cycle route map. This is actually the tramways map from 1871. So you can see that this is a bit of a habit of theirs. They didn't want poor people mass transit back then. And look, they still don't want it to this day, because here's the actual cycle route map, which, as you can see, still stops dead in very bizarre places. You know, it's always been the same for them. One rule for thee and one for me. You know, and that's what we're dealing with. And to give you another idea, is the Times from Friday, October the 11th, 1963, page 13. See this little red article down here? Oh, look, a letter about the fact that London boroughs were only supposed to have one name. So London Borough of Name. It wasn't going to be name and name. And of course, Kensington and Chelsea wouldn't have that. You know, so this was October. But a few days later, the Times actually ran an article on it themselves, because the government hadn't acted quick enough. And look at that, within 2 months, good for them, Chelsea managed to keep its name. You see, if we'd have even seen 1% of the effort that went into keeping putting and Chelsea onto the name of the new borough when they were all formed in the 60s, just 1% of that effort or sincerity from the council, then we wouldn't be talking about Grenfell recovery right now. We'd be talking about Grenfell recovered, you know, and it would be a shining example to the rest of the world on how to deal with disaster management. You know, unfortunately, at the moment, we're an example in the way that, you know, sometimes your only purpose in life is to be a bad example to other people. You know, you show them what not to do. And, you know, as sad as that may sound, this is what people around here have been dealing with. You know, we saw at least 72 people die in the early hours of the morning on the 14th of June, 2017, in a fire that burned for 60 hours in total. You know, since then, we've also seen countless suicides in this area. There was another unexplained death just a few weeks ago in this area of someone who was evacuated shortly after the fire. You know, but if you talk to the council or if you talk to the government, Grenfell's at the heart of everything they do. You know, if this is the heart, I mean, look, this is fire. I mean, shortly after Grenfell, there's another one, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and you see, and it goes on. Those were the only ones that I could find up to 2021. You know, can you imagine? At the moment, they are debating whether to spend, you know, 10 or 15 billion pounds on renovating Parliament. You know, and yet there are currently 300 plus tower blocks or high-rise blocks around this country, you know, England, Scotland, and Wales, where people cannot sleep at night because they don't know if they're going to be burned alive in their homes. There are other ones who are forced to do waking watches at the moment pretty continually. You know, the psychological toll that would take on you is imaginable. You know, and as this article shows, there have been 300 similar fires since Grenfell alone in this country. You know, not all of them get the high profile news coverage that those ones did that I showed you just then. But you know, this is ridiculous. I mean, can you imagine, look at the way the government dealt with the universal credit system. You know, before pandemic, the problems with the universal credit system, it had a famous one where if the month ended on a bank holiday, you didn't get paid that month. You got paid 2 months the following month. And they said that it would cost far too much to fix, and they fought court cases about this, saying that they couldn't fix it. It was just technically impossible. The weekend they announced lockdown, they fixed it because they knew that their voters would suddenly be using the universal credit system on Monday. So, you know, whenever they say these things are technically impossible, don't forget, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a deliberate policy. See, and even my dogs are outraged. You know, this is the one positive piece of news we have got 5 years on from Grenfell. The fact that now the fire service have this broad power of safety enforcement. So they can look at, before it was very prescriptive, the things that they could look at and actually try and make, and try and get people to, you know, rectify if there were issues. But now it's anything at all. And I've spoken with the new commissioner about this. And my suggestion to him is that, you know, they should really hit the ground running with this power. They should immediately try and set the stakes and the broadness of how much discretion they use on this as wide as possible. So I suggested to him things like if people had leaks in their home, you would take enforcement action on the grounds that it could cause electrical problems and start a fire. If there were roadworks that were out for too long, you know, you could force the companies to actually come and fill the hole in the road and reopen the traffic rather than leaving it for 2 weeks inexplicably, as they often do now. You know, if lifts weren't working in people's properties, they could demand that they were immediately fixed. You know, but unfortunately, the thing that stops this from being, you know, becoming reality, aside from the politics, because I do think they would meet quite a lot of political resistance for this. But frankly, I think now is the time. You know, we have a prime minister who has less credibility than any other prime minister ever. You know, and I'm even including fictional ones. They're like the chap from House of Cards, you know, Francis Urquhart. You know, he's even less credible than him. It's really like we have, you know, they seem to think that they're yes minister, but they're more the thick of it from what I've seen personally, especially when I've been in Westminster as well. You know, but that's why I think if our services got more bold now about these things, government isn't really in a position to resist them. You know, and our windows for opposing all of this stuff, you know, and actually trying to fight back are rapidly being closed on us. You know, judicial review is the next one that will be going soon. You know, and I mean, I would urge all of the unions to do whatever it is they can to empower as many local communities that they can to try and fight back at the local and regional and national level. You know, one thing that we didn't have on the 14th of June 2017 was any kind of real logistical support behind us, you know, so that we could get things fact checked, we could get things researched, we knew what things we should be looking for. You know, we knew what things to ask for. We knew what things we were entitled to. None of that was there for us. You know, if unions could do anything when there is a disaster that happens anywhere that they are within reach of, it would be to try and offer that kind of support to communities such as mine, because it's something that we desperately need. You know, in a just society, we wouldn't need a Max Clifford to come and basically manage manage the media for us after a disaster, just in order to ensure that we get what's fair and just. But unfortunately, we don't live in that just society. And so, you know, we do need this kind of help. You know, these battles aren't won in Parliament, as I'm sure you guys know, just as well as I do now. You know, they're won in the lobby rooms or just outside Parliament, or they're won in the media, you know, and that's it. And we haven't got the resources to be in the lobby rooms, you know, but hopefully we do have the expertise to be able to work the media. And that's what I hope would be our thing. Because otherwise, you see, that the other problem that we have is, what do the government do when they're not happy with services? They cut them, you know, and then they blame those services. It happened with the fire service. You know, I mean, the former Commissioner, Danny Cotton's comments aside about Grenfell, you know, that was an institutional failure of the fire service. That was no failure of any individual firefighters. And yet, look who was allowed to be blamed in the media. And the interesting thing about that was that the report, the phase 1 report, was we got our copies on Monday, and it was embargoed until Wednesday. And there was only one electronic copy that was in distribution at the time, and that had gone to Downing Street. And somehow the report was leaked to the Telegraph on the Monday. You know, I wonder who did that. Coincidentally, Boris Johnson had a £250,000 a year contract with the Telegraph at the time to throw in a few articles every year. I'm sure those two events are entirely not related. But you see, I think this is what happens to us quite a lot on the left. And it happens to victims in particular. We saw it at Hillsborough, and we're starting to see it now. You know, we saw it a bit with Grenfell, where even people who weren't from the area were called Grenfell fraudsters. You know, and it ties that association in the head, you know, and in the public consciousness. We saw it with Hillsborough, where people were accused of robbing the dead as they lay on the floor, you know. It's the way that the media treat us afterwards that really compounds the problem that we have. I would say that most people in this area were not, you know, were probably upset by what they saw that night. But I think the real trauma in this community has come from the way that people were treated in the aftermath. You know, I think as tragic as the actual fire itself was, people can at some level grasp that disasters happen. You know, but what we can never grasp is that, you know, when the very institutions and infrastructure that is meant to be there to help you does the exact opposite when it bothers to turn up at all. You know, so 5 years on, I would say that we're a lot wiser, but sadly progress in terms of, you know, real change to actually protect people in their homes and, you know, protect people in schools or hospitals or wherever else might have dangerous cladding. We are no further on, and we will not be any further on until we start actually using every weapon at our disposal, legal, you know, political, you know, with the media, every single tool at our disposal to fight the government and to fight business interests in any way that we can. Thank you.
Okay, Joe, thanks very much. Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Linda Clarke. Linda is co-director for the Centre of the Study of the Production of the Built Environment at the University of Westminster. She also works for London Hazards and for the Greener Jobs Alliance, and she's followed a good deal of the Grenfell public inquiry. So over to you, Linda. Linda, you'll have to unmute.
I have. I wanted to say thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you above all for organising something on Grenfell, because yeah, we owe it to all those who died. I'm going to focus particularly on what hasn't come out of the inquiry, or what hasn't been addressed, and I'm going to, can I share my screen? Is that okay? Will it work? Can you enable me?
I think so. It worked with Joe.
Oh, good. Oh, yeah, you made me a co-host. Great. Okay. Well, I've just got a few slides.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to, I mean, I should say that I spend much of my life researching the construction industry, both in Britain and across Europe. And at the moment, I'm engaged in a big project for the Canadian building trade unions on embedding climate literacy into the building trades. And so what I wanted to just address was really what the Grenfell inquiry has not addressed, which is, for me, the major question is the problems of the UK construction sector. Now I'm just going to give you a few excerpts from the Grenfell inquiry, and really the picture that comes out for me, and that's particularly, I guess, because that's what I do a lot of research about, is about knowledge, skills, and competences in the construction sector and the vocational education and training system, are those aspects. I mean, Hackett called it a broken system and said it was time to recognise that none are exempt from responsibility. But I mean, it just, when you read all the reports, what comes out is this lack of knowledge, qualification, training, and awareness of those who are involved in the whole cladding process. Ryden in particular, particularly guilty. No knowledge of standard compliance requirements for systemised building envelopes or technical details and materials. And at the same time, the unclear responsibilities. Now, I know there's some attempt now to clarify, I'm not quite sure how, on responsibilities and roles, but it was quite also clear. The Ryden project manager, it was the first job he'd ever done as a project manager. I have to say, I know an awful lot about the industry, and there's loads of project managers who've never done it before, who suddenly thrust into this job. He had never read the contract, had no training or induction, no knowledge of materials, not qualified to coordinate design and value management, had never completed the HNC that he was claimed to have. Colorblind, though the drawings were color coded. I mean, scandalous. And it was a similar story with the site managers. The clerk of works claimed he wasn't really a clerk of works, he was more like a site inspector. He didn't really know what a clerk of works did. And building control was overworked, had 120 projects in hand. And I think for those who have experience in building control, so much is privatized there. And there was a failure to check, inspect, monitor. So these come out so clearly from the inquiry, all these failings. But what then we have to think what it wasn't addressed. I mean, I just fear that the outcome, and particularly, I'm not complaining about the building safety bill, fine, to make more stringent safety requirements and testing, etc. But it's very much a kind of technical solution. And all these problems of the vocational education and training system, of the qualifications, knowledge, competences needed, the lowest tender regime which operated, which is how they got the contract in the first place, fragmented, long supply subcontracting chains, everybody divided from each other, increasingly, and this in the context of what is in fact an increasingly qualified and skilled construction labour process. What also the division that it's got worse, I think, over the last decades. The kind of division between professionals and the workers on site. It's almost impossible if you're very difficult if you're a construction worker to then progress. It used to be possible, but it's got more and more difficult. Nor the massive skill shortages we're seeing now, nor of course, and that I don't think that gets any mention at all, is this incredibly white male industry predominantly. So I mean, I think we really ought to start thinking about what's missing and the need for a radical transformation of vocational education and training in the construction industry. I mean, I don't think people are quite aware of just how apprenticeships have actually plummeted. The more anybody talks about apprenticeship, the fewer there seem to be. I'll just give an example from a London college that I'm familiar with. I mean, there's a lot. It's not that youngsters don't want to get into construction. They try, they go to the college. In this case, the College of North East London has 1,300 construction trainees, but they only can go up to level 2. And really what you need on construction sites and what is required in much of Europe is at least a level 3. And out of those 1,300, only 70 are apprentices. Now that's not unusual situation. What happened is that the employers, well, I mean, anyway, employers, that the disappearing employer, you might call it, because large firms don't employ people, and the small firms are so small that they don't have the capacity to take on apprentices anyway. So although we have what is called an employer-based system, which relies on employers, at the same time, there's a lot of talk about employer disengagement. And where we need a comprehensive, broad programs of vocational education, at least to level 3, we'd often get just private training courses, a reliance on that. And what I would call a tailorist approach, where you just try and match a skill to a particular activity. Whereas what we need is a future for young people, so they have broad occupations, qualification profiles. Now, insulation is a case in point, and this brings us to the point of cladding, of course. What is an insulator? And now I'm doing this work for the Canadians, and I keep asking this question. You can find insulation built into carpentry, roofing, various other of the main trades. But cladding's a difficult one. And I've talked to, and also insulation generally is differently understood in different places. I mean, I work with insulators in Canada. Now there they do 4 years training. They know all about cladding like you would need on Grenfell and what you need to know about it. But they're very, very well trained, and they would call it mechanical installation. And the last problem, of course, is this whole problem of career progression, divided trade, fragmented labour processes, and that applies, of course, to the construction labour process. As I've said something about the domination of small micro firms, the lack of a training infrastructure, self-employment. Half of the workforce is so-called self-employed, very severe skill shortages, a continued reliance on migrant workforce, recruitment crisis, because the aging workforce, and a very factional industry with these professional silos, divided trade, fragmented labour process, contractual divisions. So it's all a terribly sorry story. Labour only subcontracting, long chain. That's why nobody knows what, or that everybody's always passing the buck, but it's so easy just to say, no, it's not me, it's the next bit in the chain or whatever. And so that means that you can't have the teamwork that you would really need to do a successful retrofit scheme, for instance. And above all, I think the main problem of the industry is this failure to involve and value the labour that is doing all the work. And that includes educationalists and, well, of course, the construction workforce. So I'm going to finish with this because I'm going to, if it's just a, this is my, I'm constantly talking about how we need to go back and build up the local authority direct labour departments, because I mean, I know that the Westminster Tory, but still, can we imagine that we could do a successful large-scale retrofit scheme using direct labour and with the local authorities employing people, checking on private contractors, providing a complete service from design, not all this fragmentation, carrying out good quality programs under stable employment, safe working conditions, unionized conditions, and with decent wages, reducing subcontracting, not having all this labor only subcontracting, and having high levels of union organization. What a difference that would make. We would never have had Grenfell. And at the same time, of course, good quality, high levels of training. So let's at least dream and fight for such an idea, because I think we owe it to all of those who died in Grenfell. And of course, a politically and economically accountable construction industry is what everybody needs, and one that's inclusive and challenges the white male exclusivity of the sector as it is now. So that's my piece. And I'll finish there. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thanks very much, Linda. There's a lot to think about in what you said. Right, our next speaker, we welcome Vicky Hood. Vicky is a trade unionist and housing rights campaigner who sits on the National Committee of Living Rent. Living Rent is Scotland's tenants' union. So, okay, on you go, Vicky.
Thank you, Hilary, and thanks, Linda and Joe, for speaking as well. My dad was a brickie who retired recently, and he just had absolutely shit working conditions. Worked for when he was 14 to about 65, until literally his body physically collapsed, and spent the last sort of 10-15 years just on painkillers constantly. So I would love to see the unionisation and better conditions for construction workers as well. I've not got any slides, so it'll just be me speaking. So like Hilary said, I'm from Living Rent, which is Scotland's tenants' union. So we're an organisation run by and for members. By and large, tenants. We have homeowners who are supporters and are also involved in our campaigns, but have slightly less involvement and mainly focus on tenants. We've got 2,500 members across Scotland, and we organise and represent members in the private and social rented sector. And we've got 2 branches in Edinburgh, which are in Gorgon, Dalryan and Leith. Obviously want to start by paying respect to the 72 people who died in the Grenfell Tower disaster. I hate to call it a disaster because I think that it takes the blame away, and obviously from listening to Joe today, it's obvious where the blame lies, that this wasn't a tragic accident, and that the people didn't just die, but they were murdered by deregulation, murdered by the commodification of housing, murdered by the inaction of the local council and of the tenant management organisation who were supposed to be managing the building, and ignored the residents when safety concerns were raised. So I think they have blood on their hands, and that we shouldn't forget to include the blame when we talk about it as a disaster. Residents in Grenfell were collectivising and organising in their neighbourhood, just as I do, and just as other members of Living Rent do. So even though we're in different cities, I definitely feel a connection. They obviously formed the Grenfell Tower Leaseholders Association after the fire in 2010, demanded an independent investigation into the safety of the building, formed the Grenfell Action Group, wrote blog posts about safety issues in the building, raised concerns with the council again and again, and were ignored. And that's a pattern that you see, across the country, if not across the world, with people in insecure housing, people in housing that's supposed to be secure actually, but is unsafe, that they're constantly and consistently ignored. And I do think that it's fair to say that the people who died, at least 72 people who died, including 17 children, were victims of a class war. I think it's in their footsteps that we follow as a tenants union. Many of our members and some of our staff came to join Live and Rent in the wake of the Grenfell Tower disaster, and it's something that we hold in our responsibility to make sure that action is taken in their memory and in the memory of others who die from unsafe living conditions, against corrupt landlords, and that includes corrupt local councils who ignore health and safety legislation and put profit before people. So in terms of Live and Rent, the way that we're organised is on a local level. Neighbourhood branches campaign on collective issues. So for example, cleansing campaign's been a big one recently, and on individual cases of disrepair or where members are faced with the threat of eviction. We regularly have members who come to us with serious health and safety issues, who are being ignored by their landlords, with mice and rat infestations, members who physically cannot breathe because the damp in their homes is so bad. And the council, Edinburgh Council, refused to take action. Members whose children are suffocating because of the damp in their homes. Members without heating or hot water for months during the pandemic. Members who regularly choose between heating and eating because their homes are so poorly insulated. In a capital city in one of the richest countries in the world. And what we find is that it's the same problems that come up again and again. We actually had a member whose house was maliciously set on fire, and thank God that she was not in at the time, because our landlord had put bars on the window. I don't know for what reason, but those were the conditions that she was living in. And then she ended up homeless after the fire. So what we aim to do as a union is to collectivise, to turn those individual issues into a common fight. So we hold street stalls and knock on doors, we write letters signed by all of us and encourage members to speak to their neighbours, to try and create a sense of community. And I think that a lot of the work that we do as a tenants union, but also that we do in trade unions, it really does come down to a sense of community, where often it's been decimated, in the case of housing, by Airbnb, by purpose-built student accommodation, by the legacy of the right to buy, which only created division in working class communities. On a national level, we campaign for legislative change, for rent controls, greater security for tenants, for regulation of rented accommodation, and for private and social landlords to be held financially accountable. Recently, the Scottish Government consulted on its new deal for tenants, which is what they've kind of called their latest housing bill. And Patrick Harvey was appointed as a Minister for Tenants' Rights. So we responded to the consultation. As a union, we held over 100 street stalls. We had over 6,000 endorsements from folk across the whole Scotland. Unite, GMB, UCU and Unison also submitted a response in support of many of our demands. So I think that's important to mention, seeing that we are, at a trade union event. So just to go over what our demands were for that consultation, they centre around affordable homes, so a point-based system of rent controls to bring down housing costs, improve housing quality, and a greater supply of social housing, which has never been rebuilt, never been replenished since it was sold off. Quality homes, so greater and clearer penalties for landlords who refuse to make repairs, who leave their tenants without hot water, who leave their tenants without heating, who are responsible for the suffocation of children, and clearer incentives for improvements such as energy efficiency. 50% of rented homes fall below energy efficiency standards. I do know I've got a statistic here, which is that 30 to 37 people in Scotland in the rented sector are living in fuel poverty, but I mean, I wrote that down in like April, so since the fuel crisis, that number's only gone up and only going to go up. We're asking for secure homes, for greater protections for tenants, a ban on winter evictions. Nobody should be made homeless, but particularly in the middle of winter in Scotland. To introduce meaningful penalties for breaches of the law. We are consistently seeing illegal evictions in Edinburgh, often being enforced and assisted by the police as well, who don't have the knowledge of housing law that they should. We want homes that are ours. We want the right to make homes ours by not facing undue restrictions on what we can do. So having pets or redecorating, and most of all, we want stronger voices for tenants. We want control over our homes. We want rent consultation results to be binding, and to ensure that we don't face repercussions for exercising our rights and for using our voice, and not to be branded troublemakers like those who were organising in the Grenfell Tower, some of those who, are now dead, fucking burned alive, sorry, excuse me, and treated as, not to be treated as subhuman, as one Grenfell resident put it. So yeah, not asking for the world. I think that those are really, really clear and straightforward steps that the Scottish Government could be taking and can take. Just depends on how quickly they act, or if they act at all. I do think it's a choice. So yeah, thank you. That's all.
Vicky, thanks very much. Thank you. I know that Living Rent has had some inspiring victories over the years with tenants, so all power to you. We've got another speaker who was not on the advertised publicity, just because he and I took a bit of time to get in touch with each other. But it's very good he's here. So I'm pleased to introduce John Mackenzie, who is the Scottish Regional Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union. So John, where are you? There you are. Over to you.
Thank you. And look, sorry for coming, not only for the short notice of coming into this meeting, but also for arriving a wee bit late into it due to some other things we had ongoing. I think just to touch on what both Joe, Linda and Vicky have all mentioned already, there's a whole range of things I probably want to touch on.
Sorry, John, to interrupt. Can you make yourself any louder?
Yeah, of course. I may not be able to from an IT perspective, but I can speak up, Hilary. How's that?
That's great.
The IT bit is beyond me, but I will speak up. So there'll be elements that I'll touch on that both Joe, Linda and Vicky have all touched on already, but I think that what happened was a tragedy, but it was not an unforeseeable tragedy. And I think the pattern of deregulation and other political choices, and there were political choices that led to this, and I think that is one of the key features of learning the lessons from Grenfell. Not that what has happened can be made good, but of learning the lessons and moving forward in the future is pivotal. And it's certainly a key aspect for our union. So as Hilary's already said, I'm here to speak on behalf of the Fire Brigades Union. I'll try and keep it as quick as I possibly can do, and I'll make every effort to do so. I think just as every other speaker has already touched on, I think it's important to express our members' deepest sympathies with the terrible events that took place at Grenfell, what's now 5 years ago, or will be 5 years ago as of next week. The union stands in solidarity with the victims, survivors and residents, and offer our full and unwavering support in their quest for justice. I think it's also important to pay tribute to all those that responded on that night, particularly the ambulance service, NHS staff, council workers, and no less the remarkable community response that has gone on since that day, providing support to those affected, whilst many local and national authorities utterly failed to do so. I think briefly I'd want to also touch on our members in London who were in attendance that night, control staff who received truly harrowing calls from those trapped within the building, who advised and comforted them as best they could, and who stayed with many of them until the end. A fire on this scale was not planned for, simply because it should never have happened. Under these circumstances, firefighters went out with their usual practices and procedures in order to save lives. Teams became split from each other, air supplies ran out whilst they were within the building, personal safety equipment was shared with members of the public, and firefighters entered the building again and again under all normal procedures to do everything they could to save lives. But sadly, 72 people died despite the efforts that took place on that night. They did this to save others and to do what was possible, consciously risking their own lives to do so. They are proud of their job, proud of their trade, and proud to do this service for the public, but they are also workers. And almost entirely to a man and a woman, they are members of a trade union. Our members did save lives that night, but as I've already touched on, tragically far too many people died. I think particularly given some of the previous speakers, it would be impossible for me to give words that would do justice on the scale of that, or the scale of what unfolded. But the scenes that many of us woke to that morning were reminiscent of a war zone. However, these were people's homes, and were people that lived in one of the most richest local authorities in the United Kingdom. A local authority with some of the most expensive houses in the world, and with the highest gap between rich and poor anywhere in the country. A local authority that couldn't keep people safe in their own homes. And I would say that the fire that night cannot be described as a disaster or a tragedy. It was more than that, it was an atrocity. And it was one for which those responsible must be held to account. The 73 deaths from that resulted in what started as an ordinary domestic fire, the sort of fire that occurs everywhere within the United Kingdom. Such a fire is terrible for anyone involved, however it can normally be contained. Firefighters are used to these and regularly fight fires in blocks of flats and other residential properties. It's an everyday part of their trade. Grenfell was different. It was different due to a combination of events which together contributed to a result in this terrible outcome. And some of the events that have led to this, and other speakers have touched on it more eloquently than I can. But deregulation, a systemic programme of deregulation over decades, which has seen national standards in our industry abolished with the justification that they have hurt business and they've imposed burdens on the economy. Cuts and a lack of investment through austerity, which has resulted within our own industry alone of 11,000 fewer firefighters across the United Kingdom since 2010, and 40% of fire safety enforcement officers, the very people whose job is to inspect these premises, removed since the millennium. There's been privatisation of public housing within local government, and neglect of those who were tasked with the responsibility of ensuring Grenfell was safe for the people who lived in those homes. And to me, one of the biggest crimes within that, this is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And we have significant knowledge of building construction and world-leading experts in fire safety. Despite this, we have a simple reality that money could be found to carry out external work because Grenfell Tower was judged to be unsightly. But not enough could be found to keep people safe in their own homes. And this is a result of a series of decisions, and it's something Vicky touched on just in her last contribution, a series of conscious decisions, a series of systemic political decisions that created a situation where this was allowed to happen. There's been concerted attacks on council housing that has taken place, where local authority building control has been decimated and privatised, where fire safety inspections and officers have been cut, where public research is eliminated, and where governments have launched attack after attack on what they'll continually refer to as red tape. Where the Prime Minister still of today attacks health and safety regulations as a matter of routine, where local authority budgets are cut, where fire and rescue services are decimated by cuts, where the former Mayor of London can close close to 10 fire stations, and when being held to account on that, just brush it off as a joke, where national fire standards have been abolished, and where the views of frontline workers are continually dismissed as self-interested and of special interest, which is a point that Linda touched on in her contribution. And when all this happens and more, you create the environment where Grenfell can happen and is allowed to happen. And the ongoing inquiry into Grenfell and the length of time it has taken, as frustrating as it will be for many of the participants, it has to be a turning point. And we have to, despite the concerns we have about process, about what's going on, every effort has to be made by people within our positions at trying to turn it into as much a turning point as we possibly can, because it can never happen again. But we know there are properties up and down the United Kingdom which are just absolutely in a condition where it can happen again. And how do we repair that damage and make these people safe? We have to end these attacks on public safety, public services and public housing. 3 decades of assault in the public sector, a mindset that the market is supreme. Those ideas and this system are partly responsible for the loss of life that took place that night. And there is a better way. People must come before profit. Human solidarity before the narrow interest of a tiny minority. For those that have been left behind after Grenfell, the family and friends, sons and daughters, and fathers of those who died, they deserve no less than this. We have the right to ask questions and demand answers and action, not only with what happened that night, but what was happened to our society as a whole. So we need accountability. We need to learn the lessons of what happened. And more than anything else, despite all the attention that's going on with this over the past 5 years, we can never lose sight of the fact that what should drive this, it should drive the outcomes that come from it. We need justice for the people who were affected directly by the events at Grenfell. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks. Great, thanks, John. Some important points there. Right, I've got Des Loughney, who's Secretary of the Edinburgh Trade Union Council, would like to ask a question. So on you go, Des.
Thank you. It's a question about lessons learned, which has been referred to by a number of the speakers. I mean, I thought that one of the less obvious lessons to be learned from Grenfell was that it would be quality inspection of construction work and construction projects. In recent discussions I've had with the city council officials, housing officials on retrofitting, I've been told that there's going to be a huge scale of work carried out in Edinburgh, but none of it is going to be, it's all going to be in self-inspection. It's all going to be done by the private sector who are relied on to self-inspect, subject to some sort of regulations, but it's all self-inspection. So the city council itself hasn't learned the lessons of Grenfell, that the whole sector is institutionally corrupt and incapable of self-inspection, and neither the Scottish government. I have thought that was one of the obvious lessons from Grenfell, is that you need a system of quality inspection to make sure that the work is done right, with the right materials. I appreciate that there's also inspection on fire issues, which the fire brigade should be doing and should be enabled to do, but I was amazed here just a few months ago that neither Edinburgh City of Edinburgh Council nor Scottish Government believe in actual independent quality inspection of construction projects. And to me, that means there remains, if nothing else, a huge lobbying issue for the trade union labour movement in Scotland. We have to insist as a big public issue that construction projects are independently inspected, so that the right material is used and that the right quality is achieved. And I wondered, what the speakers thought of that. I mean, one of the latest examples of more sick kids in Edinburgh, where there wasn't quality inspection of the work, and it's cost the taxpayer millions and millions and millions, and the hospital's opening was delayed by years. So it's not the policy of the local authorities or the Scottish Government in Scotland. And what do we do about it? Thanks.
Des, the quickest thing you can do is get in touch with the local authority's insurance department and find out who the council's insurer is, and ask them. Do throw in a couple of freedom of information requests. So ask, do premiums go up or down as a result of these works? Because they should go down, shouldn't they? Surely, because they'd be made more safe, wouldn't they? Always follow the money. It was the same with COVID. That was how come I knew COVID was coming in January before lockdown instead of March, because I read the Institute of Actuaries blog. I'm boring like that. I was head of insurance and risk at another London borough, so I've kept abreast. And they were the first place to report, why is there suddenly a remarkable spike in the number of life insurance claims in the last quarter? And throughout the pandemic, they were castigating the government's figures as well as being too low, and they've been borne out to be correct. So, I mean, when I was head of insurance at Brent, one of the bright ideas they had was to save 100,000 when they were building the new civic centre. They didn't want to put in bloody sprinklers. So I said, okay, well, I've told our insurer that now. And they basically said that if you do that, it will add 70-something thousand per year to our insurance premium. So, and I'm not declaring that this building's safe. Are you? I'm too pretty for jail. I'm not going to jail for that. So you've always, unfortunately, in the system we have, you've just got to try and find the leverage in that system. And that would be a very good one for the building safety one, would be to force the insurers to come in and inspect, because they're the ones who then have to underwrite it. I think it's disgraceful that the insurance industry have got away with not covering the cladding problem. People buy insurance for this reason. What if there's defects identified after they purchased that they had no knowledge of? And yet, for some reason, the insurance industry has been allowed to wash its hands. And that's who I think we need to bring back in. They've got enormous reserves that they're not using.
Linda, have you got any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I made the point that the problem is partly that the inspectors that do exist, I mean, building control in particular, is just in the local authorities is totally overloaded, and half of it anyway, or more than half probably now, is privatized. And I think that's a problem. There's an awful lot of local authority services which have become commercial, if you like. I mean, and I think the planning departments need a lot more careful looking at. I mean, first of all, about planning applications going through and the costs involved and all that, and then about the whole process of building control inspection that goes on or doesn't go on. So I think it's again down to trying to really make the planning departments work in a way that they should do, which they don't at the moment. They've become more and more commercial in many ways.
Vicky or John?
I was just going to say, in that they're being allowed to mark their own homework, aren't they? And nobody's it's, I think, too many parts of local council, of the Scottish Government, where there's, on paper, there's regulation in place, but nobody's actually checking whether it happens or what's the you know, what are the punitive measures if it doesn't happen? I know they are.
The problem with that is, I mean, I remember that from even before the fire with Grenfell. You know, you'd ring up to report something and you'd say, well, you know, so they'd be like, oh yes, an environmental health issue, whatever the defect may be. But when you ring up environmental health, they go, oh no, it's the council's housing. So we can't prosecute ourselves. And I used to say, well, it's funny you've instantly jumped to you can't prosecute yourself. So you see, clearly you know that you're appallingly bad, because that's where you went to first of all. You didn't even say we can't inspect ourselves. You know, you've gone to we can't prosecute. And my suggestion at the time was that, you know, if you have a problem with your local authority's housing, that another local authority is randomly assigned to do the inspections. So their officer will come and do the inspection instead. You know, so you could swap boroughs, say, round London or round Scotland in that way. You know, and then also you could make the that way that enforcement action could be taken, because the other council can take the enforcement action. But, you know, it was far too sensible an idea, so of course it was never adopted.
John, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think very briefly, just on 2 points, I would agree with what both Joe and Vicky have said. I think the principle of marking your own homework is an absolutely valid one, and if we can't learn the lessons of some of the potential costs from that from the last 5 years, then I'm struggling to see some of the things that we will learn out of this. I think probably for us, just in terms of fire safety, and I know this wasn't the exact principle of Daisy's question, but just picking up on the point as it came in, I think on the principle of fire safety in enforcement visits, and this is right across all sectors, the rationale behind the lack of checks and balances within this is to save money. That's where it comes from. It's deregulation. It's ultimately, and the only way that's going to be suitably addressed is with sustained investment. So, irrespective of the warm words that may come from politicians on this, what is going to be required to address it is significant sustained investment to get us back to a place where we don't have this principle of marking our own homework, where there is proper regulation, and we do start to ensure that the proper checks and balances are gone through to ensure that ultimately people are safe in their homes. So public comments all very well and good, but like many areas, it's going to require significant investment to address it, and ultimately it's up to politicians to show an appetite for that and for proper lobbying to be done to address that as well. But as always, the devil will be the detail of what they're actually prepared to put behind it.
Thank you, John. I've been reading some of the, listening to some of the BBC podcasts of the Grenfell inquiry, which I really recommend. If you just Google BBC podcast Grenfell, it comes up, and they're doing it weekly. And it's just, it's so eye-opening. Particularly the relationship between the civil servants and the government. I mean, some of there was one guy who was the head of the civil, senior civil servant called Anthony Bird, who knew about the fact that the manufacturers of the cladding had fixed the tests so that they passed the fire tests, when they knew fine well that that wasn't the case. And this senior civil servant knew about these catastrophic tests, but he didn't publish it. And he allowed the use of such panels for another 17 years with the consequences that we know about. And at the inquiry, he denied a cover-up. It's just... And other civil servants who were more principled and tried to raise questions about dangerous substances being used were told, no, you mustn't upset the minister. Don't raise it because it'll make the minister uncomfortable. So, you know, national government has a hell of a responsibility for all this. Ian Mullen, do you want to ask a question? Ian?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. My first point is that I've read some disgraceful statements from both politicians and the management company, Grenfell Tower, in regards to the actions of the fire brigade on the night of the fire. In fact, the fire brigade actually wrote a book about it, which I've read. And, you know, it's one of these things with this government that they will blame everybody by themselves. And they're the ones that should have been held responsible and probably should have been in court facing manslaughter charges at the very least. So it definitely was not the fire brigade's fault. And any of the management company members or any of the government ministers who make that statement, they need to be shot down in flames, basically. And excuse the pun, because it annoys the hell out of me that they do not take responsibility for the actions that they actually, the decisions that they take on a day-to-day basis. The other thing that I wanted to say is that my professional job with Edinburgh Council is an enforcement officer with the Housing Department of Private Rented Services. And, you know, some of the accommodation that we see in Edinburgh is very substandard. We've got regulations that relate to HMOs. The big problem that we've got is actually getting them in court and getting the Procurator Fiscal to accept reports of substandard accommodation. And until that changes, the accommodation in Edinburgh isn't going to improve. And one of the biggest problems we've got, and one of the speakers said that earlier, is Airbnb are just pushing the prices up to extortionate rates that, you know, people just cannot afford to stay in Edinburgh any longer. So until that's regulated, and I would actually go even further and say it should be there should be a business tax put on it. Then things aren't going to improve. But yeah, it just annoys me that this investigation into everything that happened has taken far too long, and the families need to get some resolution to this. It's completely unfair. And, you know, I'm kind of taken aback by the colleague that was, you know, living next to Grenfell, and the fact that they want to demolish that. I actually think myself that they should keep it there as a permanent memorial to the sheer stupidity of the building industry and to the Tory government. Thanks, Hilary.
Thanks, Ian. Any speaker like to comment? John, would you like to say anything about the FBU?
If I may, Linda, sorry, Hilary, if I may. I didn't see any politicians running into that building on the night of that fire. I saw firefighters running in without breathing equipment or helmets when they were finally able to get near the building. They had to use riot shields to cover themselves from the cladding that was raining down on top of them, you know? And the fact that even with the civil servants, you know, we had civil servants who were questioned for a day and a half at this. We haven't had the Prime Minister question. Prime Minister's been questioned more for drinks he's had in Downing Street than he has for his responsibility for Grenfell Tower. And that is outrageous, you know, and I know that. I don't blame any individual firefighters. I don't think anyone around here would blame individual firefighters. You know, it was their service that let them down. Their employer failed them that night, you know, and their employer failed us that night. It wasn't the individuals that I saw risking their lives.
John?
Yeah, I think both. I mean, I think it's just important to recognise both what Joe and Ian have said. And I don't, obviously, clearly, I don't disagree with any of that, and I absolutely welcome that. And it's signs that we always pass on to our members, particularly members in London and attended these incidents. We are very conscious of some of the local sensitivities around this. We do absolutely get that, and what people have been through their experiences there absolutely overshadow any of the anything in relation to that from our perspective, our members' perspective. So we do recognise that. But I think on what Ian said in relation to the length of time the inquiry has taken. So just establishing natural justice for the family and friends, colleagues of those who lost their lives, and not only those who lost their lives, but those whose lives are now, who survived and whose lives are forever changed, and there will be many, many, many more of those than those who lost their lives. Some of those will be our members, but many, many of them will be members of the community who were not only inside Grenfell, but were within the wider community at Grenfell at the time as well. And I think one of the most marked things for our union and myself personally with this is the level of engagement that the government and some of the other core participants in the inquiry have had with it and how seriously they've taken it. It's easy to highlight some of the more shameful examples of that, but I think some of Eric Pickle's comments while he was given evidence actually hints at a really, it links into the thought process, the attitude, and how some of the people who have real responsibility for some of the decision making that ultimately led to this tragedy, and has the potential still, with many buildings just as vulnerable as Grenfell was to the disaster that happened that night, and still are today, and people who are making decisions in positions of responsibility and power today who have not amended or amended that or resolved these issues. I think Eric Pickle's comments are actually a pretty striking example of how, unfortunately, all too many of the people participating within the inquiry look at their own responsibility. They're not even willing, within the face of that, to accept the responsibility of some of their own actions and decisions have led to. But yeah, I think it's absolutely appreciate the words that both Joe and Ian have said, but they can't in any way, anything that our members that night can't overshadow the real tragedy that both the people who lost their lives and those of the wider community experienced that night. Thanks, Hillary.
Hillary, are you speaking? You're on mute.
I am speaking. Sorry. Yes, I was asking if there's any other questions. Linda, you'd like to say something?
Yeah, it's not really a question. I've just been stewing about this whole question of inspection, and I'll give you an example. I went a few years back onto a Danish building site, and I was told there, we don't supervise people here. They don't need supervising because they're all very well trained and they know what they're doing. And we have completely the opposite system here, where we train someone so narrowly, and then you need another person to manage them. And as we saw with Grenfell, they don't know really what they're doing either. So we're in this kind of vicious circle, and the saddest thing about it is that nobody trusts the in the case of construction, the workers. And a lot of that's because there isn't the training opportunities given to them to really get the proper training. I mean, the FE colleges do their best, but they've been starved of funds. So, when you think about Grenfell, it just raises so many questions about the whole system and how we need to change it. That's all.
Don't forget, it was a fridge that started the Grenfell fire. It was the fridge in Mr. Kabidi's flat that went on the fritz and caught fire. That's another failure, because in other countries, when they were told, oh, it will take us 2 years to do a recall, we're told, okay, you get fined X million euros per day until that recall is done. And hey, guess what? It didn't take them 2 to 5 years like they were doing on average here. And I'm sure John could tell us that. Indesit, Hot Point, Whirlpool, there seems to be something about their products in particular that is absolutely lethal in people's homes. And again, you see, it's another failure. Where are trading standards? You know, if a trading standards company, it's an individual local authorities trading standards department that will be taking on a multi-billion-pound international organization. You know, and that guess who wins?
Thank you. I've got a question here from somebody who can't unmute at the moment, who's called Miriam. I don't know if I've pronounced that right. Anyway, she has a very interesting question, she or he. I would like to ask the speakers if there is a single action we should take after this meeting to achieve justice for Grenfell. What would that action be from their perspective? So can I ask you all, can I start with Vicky? What would
Thank
your
you.
action be?
Thanks, Marin. That's an easy one for me. I would say join, live and rent. Like I said, we're a tenants union, we're collectivising, we're fighting for safe, secure, affordable homes for all. Obviously, Joe, I'm sorry, down in England, and I'm not sure where you are, Linda. You'll not be able to, but I'm sure you've got local tenants unions as well. And I think it's an easy step. Come along to a meeting, chat to your neighbours, collectivise.
Thank you, Vicky. How about you, Linda?
I'm not sure about a single. There's so many things. I think if I was taking a single action, I'd start with this statue, with this memorial. I really would, I think.
In what way?
We need some kind of proper memorial, and I fear that the inquiry hasn't addressed all the things that need to be addressed, really.
Linda's perfectly right. And if there is a memorial, it should be at the town hall. It shouldn't be on that site. You know, like I said, I'd rather see the site preserved, put an exoskeleton around it, 4 vertical gardens. You know, we can actually have something decent to look at for a change. You know, otherwise I was agreeing with what Ian was saying earlier. Like I was against covering it in tarpaulin. I thought it made far starker statement. If you saw it on the night skyline, you just see this black rectangular hole on the skyline. And I thought that was the biggest statement we could make at the time, because that's what there is, as Linda's pointed out. There is a black hole where there should be regulation, there should be training, you know, there should be professionalism, you know, and there should be basic humanity in the system, and there isn't. You know, that's it. And unfortunately, it seems the only way we'll hurt them is at the moment is financially. That's why, you know, because my background was insurance and risk. That was what I tried to use as a weapon to wield. You know, I still do. I'll try and hit Defective Premises Act, you know, and all the old classics when people come to me with stuff. But it doesn't always work. And it's an immensely time consuming and lengthy process. So, I mean, if there was one thing that people could do, if there was one change I could make entirely, it would be that you make a named person responsible in every company for all health and safety violations. That's it. You give them skin in the game. You know, the Chinese did that with the Y2K issue. People were worried about planes falling out of the sky. So what the Chinese did was they passed the law and they said that all airline executives had to be in the air at midnight. You see, now who's got an interest in making sure that that plane didn't fall out of the sky on New Year's Eve at the millennium? It was the people who were in it, the airline executives. That's what we need to do. We need to bring back the moral hazard. But if we can't bring back the moral hazard, I would say the best thing you could do would be, well, yeah, if you're in Scotland, you're lucky enough to be able to join Living Rent. So I can just say that. As Linda says, I mean, there's so much. There's so much. I just think a bit more accountability would be a good start. You know, I'm trying to do a study around here, and I want to use, like, because the NHS aren't reporting suicides properly around here. at the moment, and other deaths aren't being explained as well. But one thing that people don't lie on are their internet searches. You know, so I'd like to do a study where, you know, we use Google Trends data. So you look for things like how many people look up coughing around here compared to everywhere else, or how many look up marriage counselling. You know, that would show you that there's stress, you know, or other health related or stress related or life related issues, you know, and you could do, you know, I would like to do a study like that because you can drill down very, very tightly geographically on Google Trends, but it costs money. You see, I'd like to do a study where you check that all over London. So we weight it for all of London, all things being equal. Is this area more messed up than any other area? And if so, in what ways? You know, and that would be categorical proof that the recovery process has not been properly handled around here. But unfortunately, it's expensive work that you know, I can't do on my own. But it is an idea that I'm sort of rolling around in my head the whole time. And I do think it's one that would work in loads of places, especially say like if there's planning applications going in. You know, one of the things they ask is how it affects its environmental impact. You know, well, you could show, well, look, when this other building went in somewhere else, searches in that area for these things, you know, even search for things like antidepressants or something, you know, searches for these things went up in that area. So therefore, the only thing that was different was the building. So therefore, it must be the building. You know, it's very hard data, I would imagine, for the local or national authorities to refute when it comes to these things. But I mean, it's just an idea I've got at the moment. I'm no statistician either, although I found you had to become a jack of all trades in the past 5 years.
John, is there anything you want to say? Yeah.
Just very quickly on that.
Yeah.
Hilary, Linda, Joe, Vicky have all made better points than I could have done. I think they've all made principal directions of change that I think would have far more impact than I'll say. But in terms of the question, if there is one thing you can do as an individual, and unfortunately I think this maps across loads of different issues, trade unions, tenants groups, politically we'll have a conversation in this. Don't just have the conversations with people that agree with you. Have the conversations and make people accountable who will disagree with you and things. As an individual, have these conversations with people who disagree with you, because many people will have felt, not just those directly affected, obviously, incredibly angry, betrayed with our political system, disillusioned, distressed the week after Grenfell, the morning after Grenfell, the month after it. But one of the most numbing factors out of the inquiry is the length of time. And I think Joe touched on it earlier, or if it wasn't Joe, then I apologise, whoever did. The passage of time and how public it was, Joe, because he made the point about the level of interrogation that's been given about the Prime Minister's activities over recent weeks. The Downing Street, not to downplay any of that, how that has overshadowed within the media the public scrutiny of Grenfell. And actually at the sharp end of where we are, I'm not validating the inquiry and how it's been done by any extent, but it's the outcomes of that inquiry that is ultimately meant to be pointing towards some of the lessons that need to be learned of what happened there. And the only way we do that is changing public consciousness on this kind of stuff. So as one individual, challenging people, not just talking to people that agree with us, challenging people who disagree with us, who express opinions about this ignorant but honest, come across people who express opinions about this that are either directly classist or are just racist. And challenging people on those things, I think, is an important thing that any of us can do. It can be pretty exhausting, but I think fundamentally that is, as an individual, something you can do, and we can do across a lot of the issues that we speak about in forums like this. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I'm conscious that we're out of time. I just want to draw people to
quickly that link I put. If you one thing everyone could do, get 10 people who don't vote to apply for a postal vote, and then make sure they fill it out and put it in. I think that's the best thing any of us could do easily. I'll put the link in the chat.
Yep, thank you. There's also a link in the chat from Vicky to Living Rent, which is good. There's also Donny from the Trades Council has put a link to an upcoming Trades Council event, Festival of International Solidarity, which is on Leith Links on Saturday, the 25th of June. So all these things are in the chat. I'd just like to say in concluding, well, first, can I remind people about the silent vigil that we're holding at the foot of the mound a week today on the actual anniversary of the fire. So anyone who can come, please do, 4:30 to 5:30, and we'll be holding big placards, big photos of the 72 people who died. And we're hoping to have a message from Justice for Grenfell to read out, Joe. So if you could organise that and send it to me, that would be great. I've just been struck by the interchange of different ideas here and of people from different experiences and specialities. I just hope that we can somehow keep this going. I'd be very interested to know what happens at the conclusion of the public inquiry. I don't know when that is. You know, I know that the government
next month finishes it.
Is it right?
Hearings finish next month.
Right. I know that the government have already refused to implement one recommendation from the inquiry, which was to give all disabled tenants a personal evacuation plan. They've knocked that back, so they're obviously not going to take much notice of any recommendations. So I hope Joe and Linda and Vicky and John that we can keep in touch and explore more just some of the vital and important issues that have come up tonight. And thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and especially to our speakers. Thank you very much indeed. And good night. And solidarity to the Grenfell campaign.
So everyone.
Solidarity to Grenfell.
Thank you